It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 1, printed in Part D of House Report 114-74. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New Hampshire seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk, Amendment Number 1, and I offer that amendment at this time.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 1, printed in Part D of House Report Number 114-74, offered by Ms. Kuster of New Hampshire.
Pursuant to House Resolution 200, the gentlewoman from New Hampshire, Ms. Kuster, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, my amendment is straightforward. The underlying bill encourages but does not require the Director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to include women-owned small businesses and minority-owned small businesses in the membership of the Small Business Advisory Board. The bill also encourages the director to include financial institutions predominantly serving traditionally underserved communities in the membership of the Credit Union Advisory Council and the Community Bank Advisory Council. My amendment would simply change the underlying bill to make the inclusion of these groups a requirement to ensure that a broad and diverse range of voices are included in these bodies. Federal regulators should listen to stakeholders when writing new rules for our economy, and this amendment will help ensure that these advisory boards are more representative of the American people. With that, I urge support for my amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from New Hampshire reserves the balance of her time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Mr. Chairman, I claim time in opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The underlying language in this bill was a bipartisan agreement that was worked out in the last Congress. When we were marking up this bill previously, it was brought up that the minority representation would be important to this bill, and so the chairman of the committee, Mr. Hensling, actually stopped the deliberation there and worked in a bipartisan way across the aisle with Ms. Waters to make sure that we put language in the bill that would encourage the director to make sure that women and minorities, business concerns, and the Small Business Advisory Board were taken into consideration. We've addressed that, and we kept that language that was agreed to, and by the way, was passed by a voice vote. Mr. Pittenger accepted that amendment, and has been reported that the bill reported out of the committee 53-5. So basically, we have kept our word and kept in the spirit of the agreement that was negotiated in the previous Congress, and that language is in this underlying bill. And so with that, I would encourage folks not to vote for this amendment, and I'll reserve my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves his time. The gentlewoman from New Hampshire is recognized.
With that, Mr. Chair, I would simply ask for the yeas and nays.
Does the gentlewoman from New Hampshire yield back the balance of her time?
I do. I yield back the balance of my time.
Does the gentleman from Texas yield back the balance of his time?
I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from New Hampshire. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I request yeas and nays.
Does the gentlewoman request a recorded vote?
Yes.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from New Hampshire will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in Part D of House Report 114-74. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New Hampshire seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, Amendment Number 2, and I offer that amendment at this time.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 2, printed in Part D of House Report Number 114-74, offered by Ms. Kuster of New Hampshire.
Pursuant to House Resolution 200, the gentlewoman from New Hampshire, Ms. Kuster, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the underlying bill before us today authorizes a Small Business Advisory Board to advise the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau on small business concerns and practices. I agree that small businesses must have a seat at the table when federal regulators make decisions with wide-ranging consequences for our economy. And I appreciate that this legislation already encourages the participation of women-owned and minority-owned small businesses on the board. Women and minority entrepreneurs often have unique perspective and concerns, and the CFPB would be well served by seeking and heeding their input. Similarly, as a member of the Veterans Affairs Committee, I believe that veteran entrepreneurs have unique perspective and experiences the economy, and I believe that the Small Business Advisory Board would be strengthened by the inclusion of veteran small business owners. To that end, my amendment simply encourages the CFPB director to also include veteran-owned small businesses in the membership of the Small Business Advisory Board. After fighting to protect the American dream for all of us, many veterans have realized that same American dream by starting their own business upon their return to civilian life. We owe it to our returning heroes to support their success. I urge support for my amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I claim time in opposition to this amendment, although I'm not opposed to it.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And at this time, I'd like to yield to the gentleman from New Hampshire, Mr. Genta, 4 minutes.
The gentleman from New Hampshire is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Nagelbauer. Madam Chair, it's an honor to stand alongside my fellow Granite State colleague in support of her amendment. Our state of New Hampshire has one of the highest populations of veterans per capita in the United States. And because of this, both the gentlelady from New Hampshire and myself understand the importance of working together to support our nation's veterans and veterans-owned businesses. There are hundreds of veteran-owned businesses just in New Hampshire alone, and we need to ensure that our commitment does not end with their term of commitment to our military. I thank the gentlelady from New Hampshire for her amendment. I urge my colleagues, both on the committee and the full House, to support this amendment, and I would encourage them to support 1195, despite the objections of the 0.0015% in the pay-for that was earlier discussed, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves.
Yep. Madam Chair, I just would
gentleman's recognized.
Recognize myself to say that we support this. It is a thoughtful amendment, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas yields back. The gentlewoman from New Hampshire is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield the gentle lady from California such time as she may consume.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized. The
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of this amendment. I'd like to thank the gentlewoman from New Hampshire for offering this measure, which will ensure that the concerns of our nation's veteran-owned businesses are represented on the Small Business Advisory Board this legislation creates. Mr. Chairman, our nation's veterans heroically put their lives on the line for this country, and when they come home and decide to start a small business, they are carrying forth that patriotic duty by taking another risk for the betterment of our nation. Just as our nation has a responsibility to care for those who return from battle, we too have a duty to ensure those who have served in our armed forces have a voice at the table in whatever vocation they enter. Early on, the CFPB recognized the unique needs of service members, veterans, and their families by creating an office targeted to address their needs. Likewise, small businesses owned by veterans comprise a subset of our nation's economic backbone that should not be ignored. This amendment ensures that as the CFPB is made aware of their views, perspectives, and interests in the same manner as all small business owners. But, Mr. Chairman, while I support this amendment and believe in its goals, I remain strongly opposed to the underlying bill, which would impose cuts to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and would set a precedent that could ultimately lead to a time when the nation's leading consumer advocate is cash-strapped and underfunded and financially unable to ensure that the views of veteran business owners or any other business owners are appropriately taken into account. So I thank you, and I would reserve the balance of my time if there's any left.
The gentlewoman may not reserve. The gentlewoman from New Hampshire is
I yield back to
recognized.
the gentlelady from New Hampshire.
Thank you very much. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
The gentlewoman from New Hampshire yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from New Hampshire. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.